I'll try not to go on for too long so I don't stop you from going to the beach or whatever else you've got planned. But in this session, what I want to do is think about specifically childhood obesity and whether or not we might be correct in saying that the child who is obese is more likely to go on to be an adult at greater risk of diseases associated with obesity. So what I'm going to take you through very simply is current trends in childhood obesity, thinking about the immediate impact of obesity on children's health, then to address the issue of whether or not obesity tracks from childhood through to adult years, and thinking about the long-term consequences of childhood obesity specifically for adult health. And then finally I'll address the issue of whether or not childhood is the right time to be trying to prevent obesity, or whether we should be more focused upon adults in particular. So first of all then, are children getting any fatter than they were historically? Well, the answer is clearly yes. Without any doubt, children of the modern era are far more likely to be obese than children in the past. But it's quite difficult to demonstrate that statistically because of the tools which are used to define obesity. So if we're dealing with adults, it's very simple. We have the World Health Organization cut-offs based on BMI, over 25 for overweight, over 30 for obesity. But that doesn't work in children because their BMI will change considerably as they grow. So there are a whole range of different cut-offs which have been used to define obesity in the past, and that makes it very difficult now for us to compare modern cohorts with cohorts which were used historically. The most robust tool for assessing whether or not a child is obese is to consider where they lie on body mass index centile charts, but again there's variation in the literature. So historically, obesity was defined as the child being over the 90th centile or even the 95th centile for BMI, and again overweight could be defined as the 85th or the 90th depending on which system you're using. And the modern trend now is the International Obesity Task Force criteria, which will track the child along whatever centile they're on in childhood and see where they would be as an adult, and then apply the adult cutoff. And so on that basis, a child is defined as obese if they're over the 98th centile for body mass index. So it's important to appreciate the variance in the tools which are used and how difficult that can make it to actually interpret historical trends in obesity data. Having taken that into account, though, it's very clear that rates of obesity and overweight among children are increasing at an alarming rate. This is data from the United Kingdom published in 2001 and is a survey of body mass index in children aged under 5 in a particular part of the UK, and it shows very clearly that between 1989 and 1998 levels of overweight and obesity had increased by about 60% in this particular population. And there are many other studies which demonstrate a similar phenomenon, and it appears that in the UK levels of childhood obesity are doubling roughly every 10 years. In the United States you see a very similar trend, and so on current data it's estimated that about 17% of US children are obese, which is 12.5 million overweight and obese children, and that prevalence has tripled since 1980, and there are certain groups in the population that are more at risk. So this map of the United States not only shows obesity prevalence by state, it actually takes the counties within each state, and you can see there are very dense pockets of obesity in some of the poorer states of the USA, so particularly poor areas in the southern USA. And it's clear that those most at risk tend to be children from low-income families and from certain ethnic groups, particularly the African American population. Again, all over Europe, it's clear that the prevalence of obesity has increased tremendously. So this is some data from the Netherlands, which essentially shows obesity and overweight levels by child age, comparing 1980, 1997 and 2003. And if we just take the worst case possible to illustrate the fact, this is the level of overweight among Dutch 8-year-olds in 2003, which is running at about 19%. If we go back to 1980, we're right down here where it's less than 5%. So the Netherlands, like most of Europe, we've seen an increase in levels of overweight and obesity of at least twofold, maybe up to fourfold in some studies. This is data from the European Association for the Study of Obesity, which looks at the current prevalence of overweight among children throughout the EU, and it estimates that across the whole of the European area, around 5% of children are currently obese, and around 20% would be classified as overweight. And there's considerable variation between different countries in the EU. So if we look at 7 to 11-year-olds here, the most overweight and obese children are found in Malta, Spain, I'm afraid, and the Mediterranean region in particular. And if we look at adolescent children, Crete, England, Italy, Cyprus top the league table there. So clearly we have a global phenomenon here where we see rates of childhood obesity on the increase. And the reasons for this are obvious. I won't go into them. It's all about declining levels of physical activity and the current composition of the modern diet. What I do want to go on to is to think about what are the health consequences. What adverse effects does the obese child suffer during childhood? It's exactly the same as for an obese adult. It's very clear that children respond to obesity in exactly the same way as adults do. And so we see among obese children elevated risk factors for cardiovascular disease, elevated LDL cholesterol, elevated triglycerides, and they show insulin resistance and glucose intolerance, just as we see with adults. And this is producing some changing trends in disease as well. So it appears that up to 50% of obese children actually develop the metabolic syndrome. So we're seeing more hypertension among children. The profile of metabolic disease has changed completely. So the United States reported a 10-fold increase in type 2 diabetes over the period from 1982 to 1995, to the extent that we now see a greater prevalence of type 2 diabetes among children than we do for type 1. And if you think that diabetes was originally classified into early onset and late onset, it's quite surprising now to see that the late onset form is the more common. So there are metabolic consequences of childhood obesity which match those we see in adults. The cardiovascular consequences are also very similar. Now, children don't die from cardiovascular disease. Well, it's highly uncommon, and yet we see children who are obese showing the same cardiovascular risk factors as we see in adults. So here, in this study by Geis et al., you can see that the risk of having elevated triglycerides is increased by 2.5-fold in children who are over the 90th centile for BMI, who on current classification wouldn't even be called obese. We have raised LDL cholesterol is more likely, and similarly there's a 3-fold higher risk of having high blood pressure associated with childhood obesity. And that's shown here in this study by Soaf and Daniels, where around 1/3 of children in the overweight and obese category would be hypertensive. So what's plotted here is the percentage of hypertension by BMI categories. So children over the, can't read that now, over the 90th centile and over the 95th centile, we're approaching 1/4 to 1/3, are actually showing raised blood pressure such that it falls into the hypertensive category. There are musculoskeletal consequences of being an obese child as well. Overweight and obese children, first of all, they grow more rapidly. They achieve sexual maturity at an earlier age. So among girls, for example, having a higher body fat level leads to earlier menarche, and so that totally transforms their growth pattern. So they will grow faster at an earlier age, but they will probably end up being slightly shorter because they mature more rapidly. This changes the load that's on the, obesity changes the load that's on the skeleton as well, and so children carrying excess weight are more likely to develop certain skeletal defects. So Blount's disease, for example, is illustrated here, where simply the weight that's carried by the developing limbs causes distortion of the leg bones, providing this appearance, and the obese child is more likely to develop a slipped capital epiphysis, which is essentially where the growth plate within the hip joint becomes detached, sometimes to a very severe effect. And that will cause, obviously, big consequences in terms of limb movement. And finally, there are psychological consequences of being obese as well. So children who are obese tend to become socially isolated. They're less popular among their peers than children who are lean, and so this means there's a higher incidence of low self-esteem and depression. These effects can be quite modest, and clearly a lot of obese children will be perfectly happy, and this very much depends upon the cultural background they come from, whether or not obesity is socially acceptable. Girls are more affected than boys, and older children are more vulnerable in terms of psychological problems than younger ones. So there are profound consequences for the child's immediate health, but what I'm really going to focus on is what is the long-term future of the obese child, and think about whether or not obesity does track from childhood to adulthood. So what we mean by tracking is the situation where the body fatness at one stage of life persists to a later stage. So an example of tracking would be that the underweight child remains underweight as an adult, or that the obese child remains an obese adult. This is a really important issue to gain more data on, to establish if tracking of obesity does take place, because if there is a significant level of tracking, this would mean that the current explosion in childhood obesity would mean that in the future we're going to have an adult population where obesity is even higher than it is now, and the prospect of a population where half of the individuals may be obese is quite alarming from a health perspective. And at the moment, in most European countries, there's a strong emphasis on targeting childhood as a time when we should be intervening to try and prevent obesity, and that's largely founded on the idea that the obese child will grow up to be an obese adult. So is it true? Does it really happen? Well, it's actually very difficult to determine whether or not tracking does occur to any significant degree, because rather, as in my first talk, you need studies which have spanned many decades to be able to follow children through to adulthood and see how their weight has changed. A lot of the evidence we do have comes from studies which weren't designed to assess that question, and so may be methodologically flawed. A lot of those studies, because they started 30, 40, 50, even 60 years ago, didn't have the right measures of childhood body fatness at the time they initiated. If they rely on body mass index, for example, that's quite a poor tool for assessing whether or not body composition tracks from childhood to adulthood, because a major component of the body mass index measurement is lean mass, not fat mass. And so this makes any assessment of a simple correlation between adult and childhood BMI almost certainly flawed. Now, there are a few studies around now which do show some evidence of tracking, and in many cases they're quite modest. So this is some data from Wang and Popkin, who looked at a Chinese population who at recruitment were aged between 6 and 13 years, and they were only followed for a period of 6 years, so it's a relatively short duration study. And what this study showed was that there's actually quite limited evidence of tracking even over that short period. There was greater tracking of underweight to underweight. So children who were underweight at the time of recruitment, about 32% of them remained underweight when they were followed up 6 years later. If you think of that short span of time, that's a surprisingly low figure. Looking at the overweight children, only 7% of those who were overweight at recruitment were still overweight 6 years later. Again, remarkably low for such a short period of follow-up. So data like this suggests that perhaps tracking is not a major phenomenon. But you have to balance against that it's too short a follow-up. And this is a Chinese population as well, measured at a time when the dietary patterns of the Chinese were radically different to what we might see in the rest of the world. This is an older study. This is by Wright et al. And it's a study of 1,100 children in a birth cohort from the UK from 1947. And they were followed up at ages 9, 13 and 50. And the assessments made were basically body mass index at the two childhood points, and then for the adults at 50, there's body mass index and measurements of fat made using skin fold thicknesses. There was no evidence at all that body mass index at age 9 was predictive of obesity in adulthood. So absolutely no tracking was seen from younger ages through to adulthood. But among the 13-year-olds, there is some evidence of tracking there. So if we look on this graph here, we have the percentage of population who are overweight or obese at age 50, and the different colours indicate where they were at age 13. So the yellow bar shows those of ideal weight, the light blue is overweight, and the dark blue is obese. And what we can see, if we focus on this measure here, which is our best measure of adult obesity, there's a clear relationship between adult body fat and childhood BMI. So it's far more likely that a child who was obese has gone on to be an obese adult. So there is some tracking there in this particular population. But again, this cohort of individuals is not contemporary with today. So in early 1960, when these children were 13, obesity and overweight were very uncommon among children, and the kinds of diets that they grew up on are nothing like the diets consumed today. And in fact, when these children were in their early childhood, Britain was still in wartime rationing, and therefore their diet is really bears no relationship to modern children. The most frequently cited study which is able to demonstrate tracking of obesity from childhood to adulthood is the Bogalusa Heart Study from the United States. And this is a follow-up of a cohort that were initially studied when they were aged between 9 and 11, and then the follow-up was when they were aged 19 to 35. And so at initiation, we were in the 1970s, so it's a more contemporary cohort with what we have today. And this study does report quite high levels of tracking. The data here basically divides the participants into normal weight as children, normal weight as adults, normal weight children, overweight adults, etc. And the key thing to note here is the bottom figure, which is the percentage of individuals who tracked from either normal weight to normal weight or overweight to overweight, and that's 63%. So this suggests quite a high degree of tracking of body composition from early adolescence through to young adulthood. And so this is one of the most commonly cited studies which backs up the idea of tracking. So I think on balance, it's probably fair to say that there is some evidence that the obese child will grow up to be the obese adult, but it's not as strong as you might expect it to be. So what I want to move on to now is to consider what the long-term consequences of obesity are. And the reason I really got interested in this topic is because in the UK we're constantly seeing messages like this one here. Chubby kids, so fat kids, will not outlive their parents. I see that in the media so often, and it's generally accepted as true. The question is, what's the evidence base behind that? Is there really any evidence to suggest that obese children are going to have shorter lifespans? If we think about obesity in general and how obesity affects adult health and mortality, it's very clear that being an obese adult increases risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, arthritis and cancer. This graph here, for example, just shows the relationship between obesity and cancer in Europe, where we can see that for some cancers like endometrial cancer, risk is, well, about 40% of the risk of developing endometrial cancer relates to obesity. And if we take all cancers, between 6 and 8% of risk is related to obesity in adulthood. So is it true to say that the obese child is going to carry the same risk pattern regardless of what happens in adulthood? What's the most important period? Is it obesity in adulthood, or is it obesity in childhood, or is it an interaction between the two? Now, as we've just heard, it's all about interactions between genes and environment, so I don't need to dwell on this because we've just had a very good presentation on that. But clearly it's the interaction between those factors. And again, as was alluded to, it's all about lifelong exposures as well. So what the childhood diet was like, and therefore when obesity came in could be important. So essentially the question I'm asking is, are the health risks associated with childhood obesity independent of adult obesity, or is the risk of disease entirely related or tracking from one to the other? Again, very difficult to say. There are a number of studies in the literature which draw conclusions which aren't supported by their data. So I found a number of papers which claim that obese children grow up to have greater risk of cardiovascular disease, but if you look at the data, that doesn't seem to be the message that's there. So there's a lot of publication bias and a lot of misinterpretation of data. And so it's important to have systematic reviews which are able to consider this relationship. One example of a study which does draw conclusions which don't seem to be supported by the data is the Bogalusa heart study. So the data here is showing concentrations of LDL or HDL cholesterol with the population divided by adult BMI. So the blue bars are adults of normal weight and the red bars are adults who are obese. And then they're further subdivided according to the weight status of the child. If we just take this here, LDL cholesterol in individuals who are of normal weight as a child, we can see clearly that being an obese adult carries a risk of cardiovascular disease. No doubt about that at all. If we look at those individuals who were overweight children, we still see the effect of adult BMI, but there's absolutely no difference between the normal and overweight children at all. So it would appear that the main factor which explains cardiovascular disease risk is adult weight status, and it has no effect, there's no influence of childhood weight status at all within that data, which isn't what the paper concludes, I might add. So we carried out a systematic review which included 16 articles which were able to assess the impact of childhood obesity upon cardiovascular disease risk. And among the things we looked at were coronary heart disease mortality, stroke incidence, carotid intermedia thickness and blood pressure. Most of the research in the area was of fairly low quality, and amazingly most of these papers made no adjustment at all for adult BMI. They simply reported relationships between childhood BMI and these variables without taking into account weight during adulthood. And the overall conclusion of the review that there is no independent risk of childhood obesity upon any of these variables at all. All of the risk is associated with adult obesity. This is some similar data reported by Lawler et al., which looks at 3 long-term historical cohort studies. So the Boyd-Orr study, the Christ Hospital study, and the Glasgow Alumni study are all studies which began in the 1940s or earlier, and then have looked forward at risk of cardiovascular events later in life. And what we're seeing here is the hazard ratio for ischemic heart disease per BMI Z-score in childhood. And essentially we can see there is no clear relationship there between childhood BMI and any of these outcomes, apart from in the Boyd-Orr study where being overweight between the ages of 9 and 15 appeared to carry a small degree of risk. Now, interestingly, there's some data which suggests the opposite of what we might expect. What we're expecting to see is that childhood overweight is predictive of greater cardiovascular disease risk. But this is some data from the 1,000 Families cohort which I mentioned earlier, which also looked at cardiovascular risk factors in the population that they studied. They found no relationship at all between childhood overweight or obesity and cardiovascular disease, apart from here, where they found that women who had been of greater weight at age 9 actually had lower total cholesterol and lower triglycerides when they were 50, which actually suggests that the greatest risk appeared to be associated with being a thinner child rather than the fatter child. So entirely the opposite of what might be expected. A further systematic review looked at the relationship between childhood obesity and metabolic indices, such as type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and as with the cardiovascular review, there wasn't really much data there to suggest a risk. The overall conclusion was that there was only a modest independent effect of childhood obesity upon metabolic disorders. And again, as with cardiovascular disease, some of the relationships really didn't fit the expected pattern. So this is some data from Salona et al. Did report that adults with metabolic syndrome were more likely to have been underweight, thin children between birth and 7. So again, further evidence that the risk of metabolic disease appears to be associated with being a thinner child who becomes a fatter adult. And the Bogalusa heart study reported that a higher BMI in childhood predicted adult metabolic syndrome, as shown here, but they made no adjustment at all for adult BMI, so this is probably unreliable. In fact, this is from the same cohort study, the Bogalusa study, looking at insulin concentrations and prevalence of diabetes based on adult BMI and childhood BMI, and it's very clear that all the risk of metabolic disorders comes from adult BMI rather than childhood. So on balance, it would appear that being an obese child carries no independent risk for heart disease or metabolic disease whatsoever, and all of the risk is associated with adulthood. So when should we be intervening to prevent obesity? Should we continue to target children, or should we focus all our attention on adults? So we've got some evidence that lower BMI in childhood may actually actually increases the risk of cardiovascular disease in adulthood. That evidence is beginning to build up. So this is data from Hardy et al., which is looking at blood pressure in adult women in relation to their childhood BMI. And again, body composition at age 2 is the only factor other than body composition at age 43, which predicts blood pressure. And again, it goes in the opposite direction. So fatter infants have lower blood pressure than leaner infants do. So there seems to be no reason to target childhood obesity on the basis that you may be preventing adult cardiovascular disease. The reasons to target childhood obesity are to prevent the disorders associated with obesity during childhood. The main threat to health seems to be being an obese adult. So we need to get more data to determine whether or not there is tracking of obesity to adulthood, because at the moment we really can't say. We have to recognise that childhood is the best time to establish healthy lifestyles, so we should continue to focus on that aspect of nutritional education. And we need to recognise there's a lot of doubt around all of this data at the moment. And if just 15% of overweight adolescents were to remain overweight as adults, this would greatly increase the obese and overweight adult population in the future. So we do need to be very careful not to ignore this issue of tracking as a problem. But when we design interventions to prevent obesity, we do have to remember the fact that the thin child who goes on to become an overweight adult is probably the individual at greatest risk of metabolic and cardiovascular disease. And so we will have to tailor our interventions in order to prevent this situation if we can. And so that just summarises what I've spoken about, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.